Welcome. Today we're going to be doing a practice for kind of prepping for pigeon, which is a really common yoga practice or a common yoga posture. And this is a practice where we're going to be doing some things to get the hips ready for pigeon, which I consider an intermediate pose. And so you'll need two blocks of blanket and you're going to need a big strap. So the first thing we're going to do is do a little bit of hip mobilization. And so for hip mobilization, you're going to take your strap, we're going to get it nice and big, and we're going to make a big loop. And so if you are someone who has a clasp strap, one that kind of clicks in like a seatbelt, you could just click it in. If you have a D ring like I have with two rings, you're going to loop the belt through both rings. And then when you're looping it back through, you go over the first ring and under the second ring. And so that should create a strap that can be snug and consistently snug when we're putting force through it. I like to start with the strap, pretty big in its loop size because you can always tighten it, but it's much harder to open it up once you're there. And then we're going to lie on your back. Now, because we're doing mobilization and we're not doing shavasana, I like to have a little bit of a blanket underneath my head just for some support, particularly if you're someone who um, doesn't lie on the floor really consistently without support. And so we're going to lie down, and then with the strap, the important landmarks of the strap are the belt buckle, the tail, which is the short end, and of course the loop itself. We're going to start with the loop going around your right leg. It's the leg that is closest to the camera for me, so I can show you kind of how to do this. And so you're going to take the buckle and the tail, and you want that to be relatively close. You're going to put your leg through the loop, and then the loop itself is going to go right in the groin, right? So right in the hip socket. Now you've got the rest of this big loop, which is going to thread around your left foot. And so you can go ahead and do that, but the belt should be relatively slack at this point. You want to make sure when you're setting this up that the tail is handy so that you can pull it tight as you need to. As you're tightening the belt up, again, it's around your right groin and your left foot. I kind of like to make sure that it's around the ball of my left foot. And this takes some finagling. So pause and start the video as much as you need. So I got the loop around my right groin, my left ball of foot. And then I'm going to tighten the strap up as much as I can tolerate it, right? And by tolerating, if you tighten it so much that you have any numbness or tingling going down your right leg, that's too tight. We want it to be snug, but not painful. The other important part is as you're tightening it, that clasp or the D rings should not be in the groin. You want them to be, if in contact at all with your leg, on the side of your leg, preferably slightly below the thigh, so that you have access to the loop, strap, tail, but it's not digging into you. Once you have the strap relatively situated, you're going to take your hands on your right knee and just start to pull your right knee toward you. And you'll start to feel that strap digging into your hip socket. And that's kind of the goal in some ways, or in all ways, really. So we're trying to use the hip strap to teach the thigh bone, the femur, that as the knee comes toward your chest, your femur head, or the top of your thigh bone, which is in your hip socket, should actually go away from you, kind of like a seesaw, right? If one side comes up, the other side goes down. If we think about our thigh as a seesaw, as the knee comes toward you, the top of the thigh bone should go down away from you. And so because you have the strap around the anchor point of the left ball of foot, you can place some pressure into that foot as much as it feels helpful to sort of guide the groin into depth, right? Or more creasing, and help the thigh bone kind of slide away from the hip socket a little bit. Now, Of course, if you have like a hip replacement, this would not be appropriate, right? Or if you have a history of hip injuries, it's really good to have this looked at by a PT before you start, tensioning straps around your hip socket with a lot of aggression. Um, for a lot of people, this just gives the hip a little bit of re-education as to how to flex, how to pull the thigh towards the chest. And in yoga, we flex the hip relatively often, but we sometimes don't include the how as opposed to the place it here, kind of, right? And so, again, as you're pulling your knee into your chest, you can press a little bit into the ball of foot and sort of nudge the crease of your hip into a little bit of a deeper fold. And you can monitor that with as much force or as little force as you want to, right? With the understanding that if this is a new practice for you, go lighter more than heavier. Okay, so we're kind of here and we're going to stay here for just a little bit longer, right? Just kind of getting the idea of can that can that thigh be nudged downwards a little bit more? And you can even play with pulling the knee a little bit out to the side into almost a like a modified happy baby pose or external rotation of the hip. And of course, because you have a strap going through the top of your groin, there's likely to be a little bit of discomfort. And so, as you're working through this, you want to just make sure that you're still breathing, right? That you feel like you have relatively good control over the amount of force and the placement of your legs. And that if anything feels nefarious or feels a little like there's this thing called the smell test in PT. Like if it doesn't smell right, like be skeptical. If this is starting to smell funky to you, then back off a little bit, right? You don't have to go full force for this to have a good effect, right? You can even think about doing this really lightly, just as a teaching tool, as opposed to a mobilization of your hip joint, and that could be great. And so now we're going to switch sides. So I recommend grabbing the top of the strap with your hands, placing the ball of your right foot in the loop, and just simply transferring legs. You may need to adjust the tension of the strap depending on, how it feels or if the strap slid a little bit. But oftentimes it can be a nice transition just to get right into the second side without a whole lot of kerfuffle, right? And so now we've got the strap around the top of the left groin and the ball of the foot pressing into the kind of lower end of the strapped loop. And again, you've got the tail relatively close. So if you need to pull that tail to tighten the strap, you can. And making sure that the buckle is, again, away from the areas that are most compressed, which is kind of the inner groin and the top of the hip. And so then we're kind of just nudging the thigh bone up as the strap is pulling the thigh bone down, right? And it's kind of tricky to think about, especially if this is a new concept, how the thigh moves. It can be very confusing because we often think of the joints moving as opposed to how the bones position to allow those joints to move. And so, again, if you think about the long bone of your femur, it's a straight bone, relatively speaking, right? There's some angles in there, but relatively speaking, you can think of it kind of like a plank of wood. And if it was a seesaw and one side went up and one side went down, they would have to act in opposition because the wood is relatively consistent and strong, as is bone, right? Bone is relatively consistent and as strong. Of course, there is um, turnover, right? Bones are consistently kind of replacing themselves, but for our purposes, it's somewhat static. And so as your knee comes toward you, so that's the end of your femur, right? The top of your femur goes away from your hip, right? And that gives you some space in the joint so that you can slide and glide as opposed to pinch and impinge effectively. And again, if this is feeling really sensational to you or confusing, this is something that a physical therapist could be really useful for because there is a lot of people out there with that pinching in the front of the hip. And There can be many reasons why that pinching happens, and it's really nice to have a therapist look at that for you if it is of interest or if it, particularly if it's concerning. If you turned your leg out on the first side and you haven't on this side, go ahead and kind of play with some angles of where your knee is pointing. And of course, my bias is always going to be more from the physical therapy and yoga perspective, because those are the professions that I work in. But I do think sometimes we assume that yoga can fix things, and yoga can do a lot. But I think it's really important to just remember that yoga is a particular practice, and sometimes we need someone to look at our movement patterns and our joints and whatnot to make sure that the practice is doing the best thing for us, right? All right, so now go ahead and remove the strap off to the side and just let the feet come down onto the floor so that they're relatively parallel. You can place your hands on your torso or even out to the side if you like, and just notice with the legs bent and the feet on the ground, what are the residual sensations for you? Right. We're doing this before straightening our legs because it's usually a little bit more of a gentle exiting pathway from that mobilization, but you might feel some different lightness or heaviness than before. You might feel some, sometimes almost like a feeling of blood rushing, right? Hopefully the feet did not fall asleep during the strap work, so that there shouldn't be a coming back to life, of that pins and needles. That should not be happening, right? If it is, you may have gone a little far. And then go ahead and let the legs lie flat on the ground and just kind of see how it feels for the legs to be relaxed, right? They don't really have to do much here. Notice if the feet sort of flop out to the side. And if you're someone who has a pretty clear sense of your habitual nature when you lie on the floor in this kind of shavasana like posture, you might notice if it feels really different after doing that hip mobilization. Okay. And so let's keep going into kind of some more what's classically known as like hip opening, but some more like pigeon-esque routes. So you're going to bend your knees again. And this time, I'm going to have you lift up into a bridge pose. So if you have a blanket underneath your head, go ahead and remove it off to the side. And we're going to start by engaging the glutes. So arms are going to be down by your sides, feet pressing in. Before you lift your hips, feel your buttocks engaging in terms of like gathering some activity and some strength. And then go ahead, lift your hips up into a bridge with the intention of going only as high as a straight line from your shoulders to your hips to your knees. So we're not doing Setu Bandhasana or full yogic bridge. We're really doing more of a traditional Pilates bridge or a kind of a fitnessy bridge where we're looking for neutrality. And in this place of neutrality, see if you can determine what's working the most, right? Do you feel your hamstrings, which is the back of your thigh? Do you feel your glutes or your buttock region? Or are you feeling your low back? Like who of those three options, who's working the most to elevate your pelvis? Right. So just kind of take inventory for a second. And then go lower down. If you experience the low back as a primary lifter, we're going to see if we can shift that into hamstring, glutes, and a little bit of abdominals. So again, go ahead and engage your glutes. And then before you lift your hips, think about the connection between your pubic bone, right in the front of the pelvis, and the rib cage. Find almost as if there was a zipper between those two things, a little bit of tightening of that zipper, or maybe tightening of a string might be a better image for you, depending on how you feel about zippers. Keep the glutes, keep that string tightening from pubic bone to rib cage, and then start to lift the hips. And that activation of the buttocks and that zipper should help the low back stay less of the primary lifter. And it should pull a lot of the work into the buttocks into the abdominals and into the hamstrings. If you are feeling most of this in your hamstrings, just use your hands and feel if your glutes or your buttock muscles are in fact on, right? If they're in fact a little bit firm. If they are not, you can actually tap them to kind of help them turn on. That's a nice little um, technique to kind of get the brain in the right area. And then see if you can hold that a little bit longer. Keep the glutes engaged. Hopefully they're getting a little bit tired, right? And maybe try to lift the glutes a little bit higher by pushing your heels down. And notice if you go into the low back, if the low back starts to talk, try to get the glutes and the abs to tighten a little bit more, get out of the lower back a smidge. And then if you can't, you rest. So let's go ahead, lower the hips down. Now remember that that strap has been around your hip sockets. Let's pull your right knee into your chest. Imagine that the strap is pulling the groin down away from your ribs. Hands are going to pull your knee in. And then let's lengthen the left leg down onto the floor. So right knee is to the chest, left leg is down onto the ground. And you can hold the knee, the shin, or you could even hold the ankle if you are someone who is working towards getting the knee to bend a little bit more. And so see if you can keep your right knee relatively neutral. So it's not kind of starting to point out to the right. You're trying to keep that thigh neutral. And then we're going to tuck your chin into your chest, lift your head, neck, and shoulders up, and come into just a very gentle abdominal curl. As you come up into that abdominal curl, look down at your left foot. Notice if it's pointing out to the side, right? A lot of us do that, right? See if you can point the toes straight up to the ceiling, reach out through the heel, feel your thigh, your quad engage. It's the front of the thigh muscle, and maybe the glute as well. So the glute pushes the leg down into the floor. The quad keeps the knee lengthened, and then you're reaching out through your heel. And then, of course, we've got the whole upper body supported by the abdominals and the arms. One more breath in. And then exhale, lower your head, neck, and shoulders. Bring your left knee into your chest first. Lower your right leg down onto the floor, flex it. And then before we start to add more activity onto this, can you imagine that that strap is hooked into your thigh, helping the groin deepen? And I spent years in yoga class hearing this phrase, deepen the groin, and I had no idea that it had like a hip capsule application. And so that strap was helping your hip capsule be a little bit smoother in how it's helping your hip stabilize. And so as you're pulling that left knee in, can you feel the remnants of that strap pulling your groin down? And then as you take a breath in, you can bring your hands either to your knee, your shin, or your ankle, wherever you did on the first side, and then start to curl your head, neck, and shoulders up. See if you can feel that coming from the abdominals, but also probably a little bit from the front of your throat. That's okay. Look down towards your right toes. Make sure that they're pointing straight up to the ceiling. And then a lot of us will kind of wilt the knee so it bends a smidge. See if you can straighten the knee. But at the same time, press the leg down into the floor to try to engage the right buttock. Take a few breaths in, and it's nice and helpful to be able to see this with your eyes if you have the range, lifting your head and shoulders up, because in low lunge, which we're about to go to, it's hard to see the back leg, right? And so you're kind of doing that here. A couple more breaths. Notice what's working the hardest. Good data collection, like where in your body do you feel fatigue the most? And then go ahead, lower the head, neck, and shoulders down. Pull the right knee into the chest. Hands are going to come onto the knees, right? Not the shins or the ankles for a moment. Let the knees separate about shoulder distance apart and pull your knees toward your chest. And just going to notice at what point do the thighs stop folding, but the hips start lifting, right? And it's called Apanasana, wind relieving pose. Very useful if you have gas that you need to pass, whether you are an adult or whether you have an itty bitty. Right? You can push their knees into their chest and oftentimes little toots come out, which is nice. Makes the belly happy. All right, let's roll over to the side. Come up onto hands and knees. If you're someone who likes a blanket underneath your knees for cat-cow, you can go ahead and slide that blanket under the kneecaps or the shins. And then as you inhale, you'll come into a cow spine, right? Maybe letting the belly relax if that feels good for you. Maybe looking up towards the ceiling or maybe just forward. And then as you exhale, round the back, see if you can find that glute ab connection that you had in bridge, right? So the abs, the pubic bone is pulling up towards the ribs. The glutes are pulling down towards the back of the knee, and you're hollowing. Inhale, arch the back. So this is a nice almost top of the hamstring stretch, right? The glutes are releasing, the back is arching, the belly gets a moment to rest and stretch. And then as you exhale, the abdominals contract. The glutes almost feel like they're being pulled down towards the back of the knees, and the head drops. And then inhale one more time, cow spine. Let the sits bones move away from the backs of the knees. And then exhale, cat spine, sits bones move toward the back of the knees, head drops, pubic bone lifts. And then we're going to come into downward facing dog. You may need to walk your hands a step forward to get enough length in your dog. Tuck your toes, lift your hips. Keep the knees bent as you arrive in your first Adho Mukha Svanasana. And just kind of notice what you feel initially. Might even notice what you see initially, right? Are you someone who immediately closes your eyes when you're upside down? Or do you kind of stare at your toes or your ankles or your knees? Like, where do you habitually go visually? Let's come to plank on an inhale. So inhale, move your chest forward. If you need to adjust the length of your stance where your hands and your toes are, feel free to do so. Take a breath in your plank. Exhale back to downward dog. Keep your hands and your toes where they're at. Bend your knees. Lift your hips up. This might be a longer down dog than you're used to, but just kind of give it a shot. See what it feels like. I like a longer down dog than some practices teach so that we can get more length in the spine and less tailbone tucking down to the heels. Again, inhale, come forward to plank. Plank should feel kind of buoyant and strong, arms pressing down, thighs engaged, abs engaged. Exhale, downward facing dog, knees bent or straight, but sits bones, right? The bones in your bum, lifting up and back toward where the ceiling meets the wall. Last one, inhale, come forward, plank. And exhale, downward facing dog. All right, let's walk your feet all the way up to the top of your mat. Grab blocks underneath your hands as you like. For your standing forward bend, Uttanasana. Bending the knees as much as it feels helpful to let the spine roll over the thighs. Inhale, come to a flat back. Maybe bring your hands to your shins, pressing the hands back into the shins. Knees could be bent or straight, but as you press the hands back into the shins, can you feel that can help pull your chest forward as if your spine is growing out of your pelvis? And then exhale, fold all the way back down. This time, inhale, reach the arms out to the side, up to the ceiling, upward hand pose. Push the heels down. Try to pull your rib cage out of your waist, kind of get longer, kind of like a slinky opening up. And then exhale, mountain pose, arms by your sides. So we're gonna do 2 half sun salutes. Inhale, reach the arms out and up. Maybe look up at the ceiling if that feels okay. Exhale, dive forward with the legs. Hands could go onto blocks or the floor. Drop the head, bend the knees if that's helpful. Inhale, flat back. Let's again bring the hands to the shins to help the chest move forward. Exhale, fold all the way back down. Inhale, reach the arms out to the side, up to the ceiling, upward hand pose. Exhale, mountain pose, arms by your sides. One more just like that. Inhale, lift the arms. Exhale, dive forward over the legs, standing forward bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward. Exhale, fold. Inhale, reach the arms out to the side, up to the ceiling, Urdhva Hastasana, upward hand. And exhale, mountain pose. Adding on, inhale, lift the arms. Exhale, dive forward of the legs, standing forward, bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward, bend the knees deeply. Step the left foot back, low lunge. Try to get all the way back to the length of your plank. Take a breath and look forward. Exhale, step back, downward facing dog. Inhale, come forward to plank position. Exhale, lower the knees. Inhale, shift your shoulders forward over your fingertips as the elbows bend and lower all the way down. Inhale, baby cobra, kind of our first back bend besides cow. So just kind of take a moment here just to feel your spine pulling kind of closer together, if that makes sense. So we're bending the spine back, trying to pull the chest up. And then exhale, lower the face. Take a breath in at the bottom. Exhale, press up and back, hands and knees first, tuck the toes, then lift the hips, downward facing dog. We're gonna take 3 or 4 breaths in this down dog. Again, knees could be bent or straight, totally up to you. Trying to find relative stillness so that there's not too much fidgeting or wiggling around. There's a definite benefit to fidgeting and wiggling around, but there's also a benefit to trying to maintain sort of relative stillness as well. As you inhale next, lift your heels up nice and high, bend your knees, look forward. Exhale, walk your feet all the way up to the top of the mat, standing forward, bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward, hands to shins, pulling the chest out of the pelvis. Exhale, fold all the way back down. Inhale, reach the arms out to the side, up to the ceiling, upward hand pose. Exhale, mountain pose. So we'll do the other side. Inhale, lift the arms. Maybe look up, push the heels down. Exhale, dive forward over the legs, standing forward, bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward. Exhale, bend your knees, step your, your right foot back, low lunge. Take a breath in, move the chest forward. Exhale, lift the hips up and back, downward facing dog. Inhale, come forward to plank position. Exhale, lower the knees. Inhale, shift your shoulders forward over your fingertips as your elbows bend, and very slowly lower your torso as best you can. Inhale, baby cobra. Lifting the chest. Exhale, lower. Inhale at the bottom. Exhale, press up onto hands and knees. Tuck the toes, lift the hips. Downward facing dog. And again, 3, 4 breaths here. Relative stillness for this practice, at least. Try to let your head drop. And try to lift the sits bones or the hips up and back. Next time you inhale, lift the heels up high. Bend the knees, look forward. Walk the feet up to the top of the mat as you exhale and find your standing forward bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward. Exhale, fold. Inhale, reach the arms out to the side, up to the ceiling, upward hand pose. Exhale, mountain pose. Okay, we're gonna do a little bit of a variation. Inhale, lift the arms, Urdhva Hastasana. Exhale, dive forward over the legs, standing forward, bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward. Bend the knees, step the left foot back, low lunge. And then solidify your feet into the mat, come up into your high lunge. So we're gonna stay here for a couple of moments. As you stay here, see if you can engage through your back leg a little bit more clearly, right? And what I mean by that is, do you know how that leg is supporting you? Are you able to feel your left quad, front of the thigh, and left glute, buttock area, engaged simultaneously? So that's your back leg. So the back leg is actually not necessarily just a kickstand, just there to help you balance. It's actually actively helping open the front of your left hip. And then the front knee needs to be aimed straight forward. So it's not caving in or wobbling out to the side. It's nice and steady. And that actually takes quite a bit of awareness to do both of those legs at the same time. But when we talk about a posture like pigeon, which is pretty complex, the legs are doing things, you have choices with the torso. We have an opportunity to develop an awareness of checking in with multiple areas of the body as, harmoniously as possible so that we don't end up tweaking something because we kind of forget about it, right? And so keep checking in with the back leg and the front leg. My dog is hunting flies today. She keeps running around huffing. And then exhale, bring the hands down around the front foot to the floor, step back, downward facing dog. Inhale, come forward to plank. Exhale, lower the knees. Inhale, shift your chest forward as you bend your elbows and slowly lower down. Okay, so now that we're down here, you're gonna make a pillow with your hands underneath your forehead. I'm gonna keep my head lifted just so that the sound quality doesn't get a little bit weird. But you're gonna relax your head. And then just notice for a second, if you could decide with your back legs, do they feel turned in, centered, or turned out? Turned in would have the heels farther away from the center than the toes. Neutral would have the heels and the toes equally away from the midline. And then turned out would have the heels closer to the midline. And so we're going to try to have the legs neutral. So if you need to wiggle the hips a little bit and adjust the legs, that's fine. I'm going to see if you can lift the left leg up without letting it turn in or out. And so that can be relatively tricky, especially if you don't have a good sense of where the leg is in space. And that's great. Like that's what we're developing. And so as that leg is lifting, you could even play around with, okay, well, what if I tried to turn it out, right? Kind of pull my heel toward the midline. What does that feel like? And if I go back through center, even if I'm not sure where center is, what if I turn in? So I'm trying to push my heel out to the side and then come back to center. Maybe do that one more time. Things might start burning a little bit muscularly. That's fine. And then maybe go through center into internal. And just for the last moment, just for the last moment, find neutral. Maybe try to lift the leg another centimeter, right? Real small. And then let it lower down and rest for a sec. And as you rest, notice where you feel some tension kind of resolving in your leg. Is it more in the hamstring, in the glute? Is it more the outside or the inside? Just kind of get a sense. And then we'll do the other side. So lifting, I believe, your right leg up. And first, just kind of ask yourself, does it feel neutral? Does it feel turned out? Or does it feel turned in? Right. And again, it's okay not to know, right? That's part of the practice, is to really develop a sense of trying to be able to see things with your mind that it's hard to see with your eyes. And so then let's play. So go ahead, turn the leg all the way out. And then go back through center and then turn the leg in. You're also trying to keep your knee straight so that it doesn't bend and turn out and in, right? So the quad should be relatively active. It might feel like that lowers the leg a little bit, which is fine. Height is not really the goal here. And then turn in. Clarity is really the goal. And then turn out. And turn in. And then find center once more, rest the leg. Again, see if there's any kind of remnants of sensation, like who was working and now starting to kind of dial down the intensity, right? The fatigue, potentially the burning of a muscle. And then we'll return to this momentarily, but first go ahead, bring your hands underneath your shoulder, come into a cobra, small, medium, or large, totally up to you, depending on what your spine feels like it's ready for. Exhale, lower all the way back down. Inhale, prepare, feel a little abdominal contraction. And then exhale, slowly press up onto hands and knees. Tuck the toes, lift the hips, downward facing dog. We're gonna lift your left leg up, down dog split. So it doesn't have to go high, but try to keep it neutral as best you can. So it's neither turning in nor out. See if you can feel those glutes or hamstrings or whatever muscles were working when you were on your belly. And then as you exhale, pull the foot as far forward to the top of your mat as you can. Now, if it doesn't get up to the top of your mat, pull it as far forward, place the toes down on the ground, shift over onto your right hand, grab your ankle with your left hand and hop it forward, right? That's a nice way to kind of do that transition, even if your foot doesn't quite get there on its own. You're gonna bend the back knee a little bit, step the right foot forward and come to your standing forward bend, Uttanasana, forward fold. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward. Exhale, fold all the way back down. Inhale, reach the arms out to the side and up to the ceiling, upward hand pose. Exhale, mountain pose. Notice for a moment if one leg feels different than the other. For instance, more awake, longer, more grounded, or just more present. It's slightly vague kind of terminology, but and then notice if there's a difference right to left. And let's do the other side. Inhale, lift the arms up, take a breath in. Exhale, dive forward over the legs, standing forward bend. Inhale, flat back, chest moves forward. Bend the knees deeply, step your right foot back into your low lunge, nice and long. Solidify the feet into the mat, come up into your high lunge and find your balance. And so we'll go through the same sort of checklist that we did on the first side. So we're really focusing on the back leg first, right? So notice if there's room to activate your back leg a little bit more, particularly in the front of the thigh, the quad, in the buttock or the glute, and see if that gives some kind of stability to the knee and some opening to the front of your right hip. And then check out your left knee, make sure it's aiming straight forward. It's not kind of diving in or out. And then just take a few breaths. One more inhale. Exhale, bring your hands down around your front foot, step back, downward facing dog. Inhale, come forward to plank. Exhale, lower your knees. Inhale, shift your shoulders forward slowly, bend your elbows. Try to lower the chest and the belly down at the same time. And then make a pillow again underneath your forehead. So we're gonna start with the right leg first this time. So you're gonna, again, try to make the legs as parallel as possible. Float the right leg up and see if you can just maintain neutrality first so that you're not turning that leg in or out. Now, just like we did in the bridge, notice if you feel like you're doing this action from the lower back, the glute, or the hamstring as the priority. The other thing to ask is the quad active? So that's the difference between this and a bridge, right? Do you have quad activation? Then go ahead, lower that right leg down. Try the other side. So you're trying to keep the leg neutral, lift it up. And then ask, is my quad on? Keeping my knee straight? Is there room to straighten my knee more? This assumes that you don't have significant hypermobility in the knee, right? And so if you do, that might be a cue that needs some modifying. But for most of us, see if the knee can be fully straight. And then who's working more, low back, glute, or hamstring? If you had to choose. And then lower down. Just rest for a few moments. We're going to do that one more time. So, in the way that I'm curious about your experience, is we're really looking at something called hip extension. So, we talked about hip flexion when you had the strap around your groin where the thigh is pulling towards your chest. This is the opposite, right? The thigh is effectively moving as far away from the chest as possible, almost so much that it's going toward the back of your body, right? Into the back space. And so, just like you can isolate a motion at the hip for hip flexion, you can do the same in hip extension. It's just not as great of a range of motion. And so, a lot of us, what we do is instead of isolating this action of lifting the leg behind us from the hip, we do it from the pelvis and the spine. And that's when the low back takes too much, right? That's often where we lift bridging from too. And so, let's try the right leg again. Engage the lower abs a little bit. So that's going to help prevent the low back from arching excessively. And then if you try to lift the right leg, primarily, the low back is probably going to help a little bit. But if we were trying to lift the leg as simply as possible from the thigh and the glute, with particular interest in the glute, right? Is that possible? Right? And do you get some weird sort of activating and burning sensations down the inner or outer leg, right? And when I say burning in this instance, I don't mean nerve burning, I mean muscle fatigue burning, right? And so it's not electric, it's more of like a slow, like, oh, that muscle hasn't turned on in a while kind of feeling. And then go ahead, let that right leg come down, switch sides. So keep the abdominals active to help protect the lower back. We're protecting it, but we're just really stabilizing it. And see if you can lift the left leg up from the glute hamstring. Notice if the low back really wants to get involved. If it can, if it does rather, can the glute and the hamstring be asked to do more? And then do they respond with a yes or a no? Right? Can you choose how you want to move as opposed to moving through the path of least resistance? And then go ahead, lower down. All right, bring the hands underneath your shoulders. Let me just move a little bit to the side because my dog has joined me. Come into cobra, small, medium, or large. And then exhale, lower back down. Take a breath in, keep the abdominals engaged a little bit. Exhale, press up onto hands and knees. Tuck the toes, lift the hips, downward facing dog. Let's have bent knees for this down dog, just in case the lower back got a little overactive in that hip extension work. Now, I know that the way that I teach has a lot of anatomy in it. And the reason for that is because our bodies are smart, right? And they have this inherent quality of knowing how to move as long as we allow them to do so with clarity, right? And so sometimes as we move through things, go ahead, come down into child's pose, knees wide, toes together, arms reaching forward. We can build into a pose through these sort of really what they are is they're retraining your brain how to feel where you are in space and what to engage. Reach your arms forward, drop your forehead to the ground. And so what we just did with hip extension is locust pose at Shalambhasana, right? Or swimming from Pilates. But we're doing it in such a way where we're giving it enough time to analyze how we're doing what we're doing so that then we can apply it when things are moving faster in a more complex state. Okay, so now let's go on to our version of pigeon that we're going to be doing for this practice. I recommend having a blanket underneath your head. It's always kind of nice. We're going to lay down on our backs. And then sometimes it's nice to have a block near the feet, right? And so I'm just going to put a block near my feet on its lowest height, because that way I can slide it in with one foot if I need to, or slide it away if I don't need it, as a way to give myself a little more support. So block on its lowest height near the feet so that you can kind of access it. It's nice to be able to use the feet for more than just walking and running and stair climbing. And then we're going to start with your left ankle crossing over your right knee. And we're going to set this up in a relatively particular way. So just kind of stay with me. If you already know where we're going, just figure four stretch or upward facing pigeon. Before we do anything else, flex your left toes back so that your ankle is active. If you let your toes flop, it's so much easier to twist the ankle inwards when we start to ask the hip to be open. And so go ahead, flex the toes back and make sure that the knee is not aligned with the foot, but it's really the ankle on top of your right knee. Then press your left thigh back away from your chest by using the power of your hip, right? So I'm not using hands. I, in fact, have one hand on my dog, who I think has been traumatized by flies over the course of this class. And then one hand is just doing whatever, right? And so as your knee is pressing back away from your chest, you might feel some activation in that left buttock, right? That would be very normal. It could be even deeper than what you're used to feeling in your left buttock for something like what we did on our bellies. And this might be enough of a stretch, right? Could be a stretch in the inner thigh a little bit on your left leg, in the front of the hip, could be great. If you want to take this further, you can pull your right knee into your chest and grab on to the right thigh or the right shin, but that takes quite a bit of hip mobility. And so if that's not where you're at right now, that's fine. That's why I got the block. You can slide the block underneath that foot so that you're a little bit lifted, and you can still work on flexing your left toes back and pressing the left knee away from you. It's a really nice, more supported passive way. Not really passive because we're still activating the left leg, just a more supported way where you're not trying to crane your body into a pretzel that it may or may not want at this point in practice, right? If you are pulling that knee in and holding onto the leg, just make sure that your toes haven't wilted, right? And that your knee is still actively pressing away from your shoulder, right? So the leg is not passive again, right? Still active. And we're just going to breathe here. So this is your upward facing pigeon. And what's nice about this is if you had any history of knee issues or surgeries, this is much more under your control in many ways than a standard pigeon. And it's just a really nice way to get some rotation at the hip without tweaking joints. You know, it's kind of great. All right, so go ahead and place your right foot back down on the floor. If you have that block, you can slide it away. Then we're going to switch sides. So before you switch sides, you can pass the block over to the side that you might need it if you used the block. If you didn't, it's totally fine. First, cross your right ankle over your left knee. Flex the toes back so that helps protect the ankle. And then press your right knee away from your right shoulder. I'm just going to notice, how does that feel? Are you already sort of jumping ahead, right? Can you pause here and see what especially if this is not a lot of sensation for you and you're really looking for a stretch, what does it feel like just to be in space, to be in a position? And then when you're ready, if you want to, you can hop that left foot up onto a block by sliding the block underneath it. Or you can reach for your left shin or thigh with your hands. Keep the right toes pulling back and the right knee pressing away. So again, we're trying to keep that leg that is probably under the most stretch active. And one of the reasons why we do that is so that the brain still feels like it has control or agency over the leg that is under the most stress, right? When the brain has agency over tissue, oftentimes the tissue responds a little bit more favorably, right? Because it doesn't have to go through this worry about like, oh, am I overdoing it? Do I need to compensate somewhere else? Now, it often also makes you not be able to go as far, which is fine, right? Again, yoga is not about depth of position. It's really about knowing where you are in space and knowing how to work with sensations and discomfort and difficulty. And so maybe limiting a little bit of the range by giving yourself some of these strategies and these stabilizations is a good thing. Okay. And then let's come out of that. We're going to do one more bridge to finish before Shavasana. So again, you can take that blanket out from underneath your head, arms come down by your sides, engage the glutes, still engaging the abs. So we're not really going to Setu Bandhasana, full bridge pose. We're going into more of like our traditional fitnessy Pilatesy bridge. So straight line, knees, hips, shoulders. So go ahead, lift the hips. And again, feel if you feel your glutes, your hamstrings, or your back. See if we can prioritize the glutes and the hamstrings. And if you need some support for your back, engage the pubic bone and the rib cage toward the center, towards the navel, right? So it's not sucking your belly back to your spine. It's guiding your pelvis and your ribs into a straight line. And then when you're ready, lower the hips down. You could just knock the knees together and turn your legs in a little bit for constructive rest for Shavasana. Or you could come with straight legs. You might pull that blanket back underneath your skull if that's nice for you. And then let your arms rest on your belly or out to the side. You can let your eyes close or cast them up to the ceiling really gently. And we'll rest in Shavasana for about 10 minutes tonight. Slowly bring your attention back to your breath. See if you can let your body drop a little bit deeper into the floor. And then when you're ready, on an exhale, bend your knees, step your feet to the floor one at a time if they're not already there. And then exhale again, roll to one side, pausing on your side for a moment or two. Kind of resettle the weight of the body down into the floor. And then on another exhale, press yourself up to sit using your hands pressing into the floor. Perhaps sit on the blanket that might have been underneath your head in a cross legged seat. Hands resting on the thighs, spine upright. Eyes could be closed or cast downwards. Feel if your pelvis can kind of sink down into the floor or the blanket where your pelvis is resting kind of on top of your thighs and not being pushed backwards because of tension in the front of your hips or in the back of your hips. Next time you inhale, bring the hands together in front of your chest, Anjali Mudra. As you exhale, bow the face down towards the fingertips. Act of gratitude for taking time to practice. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be safe. Namaste.